Hello everybody, welcome to my reaction on the Lost on the Ice in the North Atlantic Ocean by Scary Interesting. Now I do like Scary Interesting. He does a lot of really cool, mysterious, scary stories and some cryptic stories and that sort of thing. I love cryptic stories and mythology and that sort of thing, folklore. Don't necessarily believe in many of them, but still they are really fascinating. And I don't know if you can see the camera is a little bit behind. I don't know why. I hope it's not in the post editing. So, but I can see it right now. It's a little bit after, a little bit laggy. I don't know really know why. So if it is like this in the post editing, sorry, I'm gonna try to fix it later. But anyway, so yeah, I've not seen this video. The only thing I can see right now from the image is that, and the title is that something happens in the Arctic. It's not about the terror, the terror and Erebus, right? The Northway Passage incident, which happened like late 1890, something like that. No, 1870, somewhere around 1870, 1890. I don't really remember the exact date, but somewhere around there. And that was just an unfortunately series of events. But and also go and watch that TV series called The Terror, I think was called. Absolutely amazing acting and actors and special effects and that sort of thing. Though it's not it takes a very how should I say scary movie kind of approach and kind of like divert from realism, but still it's a really good TV series. The Terror, I think was called something like that. Was it Amazon or HBO? I don't remember exactly where I saw it. It was like 2 years or something. But yeah, anyway. So I don't know what other kind of. I mean, I do know there's a lot of Arctic and Antarctic expeditions that went horribly wrong. And hindsight, 2024, yes. When you look at it right now, it's like, what the? Are you dumb? Are you stupid? Very hindsight, as I said, 2024. Back then, you gotta remember something. This is kind of like because there's a camera here, I can imagine it must be 1870 or 80, maybe 90. But back then, during the kind of like the height of the Industrial Revolution, the exploration of the world has pretty much been done with. I mean, the only last places on Earth that's not been surveyed and what we call it scientifically explored was either the Antarctic, the Arctic, the Antarctica, and a little bit of the South America, especially the southern part of it, I think it was, or Amazon forest and that sort of thing, the Amazon rivers and the floods and that sort of thing. Africa was pretty much starting to become fully explored because this was kind of like the after effects of the rush for Africa when all of the major great European powers starting to colonize Africa and service did a lot of exploration and scientifically research about the tribes and that sort of thing. But anyway, so back then the Arctic and the Antarctic was a very highly prestigious races for a lot of nations. I do know we have a Swedish expedition for the Arctic, which ended horribly. I don't remember the names right now. Lindström. There were 3 people, I think it was, that set off from a balloon from Svalbard. And they were trying to survey the Arctic from the air via the balloon, and it was a pretty big balloon as well. But they crash landed. They survived pretty long as well. I think they lasted several months or something. Mainly because they were pretty prepared for everything. They have guns. They have probably clothing. And they have lots of food apparently and sleds. But unfortunately, it ended horribly. I think it was because we had a lot of diaries and that sort of thing. Back then, a lot of people used to write diaries, but thankfully they did find their diaries, so we could at least know exactly what happened. And it kind of like with that expedition to the South Pole, Scott's expedition, I think was called, who were the second expedition to reach the South Pole. I think it was like 2 months prior, a Norwegian explorer, Amundsen, I think it was called, who reached the South Pole first. And then you have that iconic pictures, both when the Norwegian flag was raised on the South Pole and when the British expedition found the flag. And the British expedition led by, I think it was Robert Scott, I think he was called. Unfortunately, that expedition was just not prepared for that. That immense cold weather of the Antarctica. So unfortunately, all of them perished. But the reason why we know a lot of things what happened during that time, because they also had a lot of diaries. The thing about the Terror and Erebus, we also had a little bit of diaries and logbooks and some messages left behind. And then of course we found the 2 wrecks, so, and a little bit of what do you call it, interviews from the natives, the Eskimos, I think was called. Not really. Are they Eskimos? I think they're called something else in northern Canada, somewhere around there. King George Island, I think was called, in that region where they found the wrecks. Anyway, so now this I have not heard about, so it's gonna be interesting to see.
On a massive sheet of ice floating in the North Atlantic Ocean, and your ship and only salvation was impossible to see in the snowstorm that surrounded you. And every minute that went by was 1 minute closer to the frozen night.
So it's gonna be some sort of expedition where a ship gets stranded, which is very, very typical back in the day when they were serving the North Passage and the Arctic and even the Antarctica. There was a lot of expeditions where the ships were stuck and they have to abandon it. There were even some cargo ships that got stuck and they have to abandon it. But back then they also had, it was starting to, the telegraph was starting to be standardized on ships and that sort of thing. So, but it could be more easily to send out messages and cry for help, basically. I don't know really what if they had it on this one. I don't know where it's taking place.
During which some of the men with you wouldn't wake up in the morning. This is the horrifying story of the 1914 sealing disaster. As always, viewer discretion is...
Okay, so a sealing disaster, 1914, that's pretty much right at World War One. So is this like a war story?
Advised. The commercial sealing industry was a thriving one early in the 20th century for the island of Newfoundland, which is a little island on the east coast of Canada. And Newfoundland's...
Yeah, seal market back then, it was pretty high, mainly for the pelts and the fat. I don't remember what it's called now again. And of course a little bit of the oil that they could produce from the fat. So back then it was pretty common for a lot of poorer people from the lower classes to enlist in kind of like a merchant fleets to go up and hunt for seals and that sort of thing.
Its capital city, St. John's, couldn't have been more perfectly placed geographically for sealing companies. Exiting the harbor there put ships right into the North Atlantic Ocean, which was abundant with their catch, which was seals. In recent decades, seal hunting's become highly controversial, and for good reason, but more than 100 years ago, it quite literally built communities like St. John's. A significant percentage of its
What do I think that is, when it comes to this sealing hunting, if we're talking about communities, as you said, that are located, that is sort of very harsh and uninhabitable areas in the north and the south, then I can approve seal hunting because they need it. I mean, there's nothing else around, especially in the Arctic. There's like what, polar bears, occasionally some orcas, dolphins, maybe some sharks and fish, and obviously seals. But then in Antarctica you have mostly like seals, orcas, and penguins. So, but today you always see that tradition in the Faroe Islands where they go out and hunt seals. A little bit, yeah, it's a little bit horrific, but it's also tradition for them. To me, it's more like let them be, like, not the seals but the people. Let them have that sort of thing. I mean, it is not like it is killing every goddamn seals in the entire world in just the Faroe Islands. Like, it's their way of life. That's just it. I mean, it's horrible, yes, but I have grown up with a hunter family, so it's just nature for a lot of people, and it's their tradition. It's their way of. It's just their way of life. It's not like they are actively hunting seals every day. No, they wait for specific seasons because otherwise they would overhunt and that sort of thing. Like, these people, they know what they're doing when it comes to seal hunting and other sort of hunting. They know. So yes, it's horrific, but if I was one of those Faroe people, I would definitely do it too, because there's nothing else to, harvest or sell or get food or materials. They just have to sometimes.
Population were either actual seal hunters or worked for a sealing company in some capacity, so it was hugely relied upon by many. As you might imagine, the work of the average seal hunter was as grueling as it was gruesome. It was messy, physical work with little safety regulation, typical of the time period. This often resulted in overworked crews that spent up to 12 hours straight on sheets of ice known as ice floes.
12 hours.
Because that's where seals spend most of their time, seal hunters would be dropped off on the ice and then have to walk miles to reach these herds. Then after a successful hunt, they'd have to walk the same distance back to the ship. This was standard practice because
Even though I absolutely despise cold and winter and snow and that sort of thing, even though people are saying you're Scandinavian, it's in your blood to love winter and sort of thing. No, a lot of us Scandinavians absolutely despise winter, especially the spring times. It's absolutely horrible. Like, I can tolerate like maybe like a month of minus 20 degrees or something Celsius, no problem. But if it's going on for months until like the July, let's say, then I'm going to say, fuck this, I'm leaving this country. But, and also I don't get people who pay to go to something like the to like ski resorts and something. I don't get it. I just do not get it. Why? I always said that when I'm dating girls and that sort of thing. Do you like ski resort? Do you like to go there? If one of them answer yes, it's over. I don't want to date you anymore. I'm sorry, but I don't get it. I do not get it. I'm sorry. The only thing I could probably say that I would actually go to an icy place, like a proper Arctic or tundra or something like that, it would probably be the Arctic or Antarctica, just to be there, to see. Even though it's nothing there and it's nothing to do, it would still be an experience of a lifetime. But ski resources and that sort of thing, screw that. It's boring, it's crowded, it just... No!
seal herds would get spooked if a ship just pulled up alongside them. In addition to that, ships could only get as close as their equipment would allow in the thick ice. And this is all before taking the unpredictable weather of the North Atlantic into account. Strong storms could hit with little warning, and this is especially true as seasons transition between fall and winter and spring. In April, these ice floes, which can grow up to 6 miles wide, start to melt and become fragile or break apart entirely. This allows ships to get through the ice much easier than in the colder months, but that's only if a ship has strong ice-breaking capabilities. Icebreaker ships have a specially shaped and reinforced bow to help break apart and push the ice out of the way. Even with that special hull, ships could still get stuck, but this was especially true for those with a traditional hull. They could easily get stuck in the ice for days, and that is exactly what happened to the SS Newfoundland during the last days of March 1914.
Oh, so
Built in 18...
March, so it's around 2 months until World War One starts. So I think it started around the 28th of... Was it June or July? I think it was July, because it was called the July Crisis, right? And the Black Week or something like that. After the assassination of Franz Ferdinand. So, okay, so it's a little bit before World War One. The tension at this point in Europe. Sorry, I'm just making sure that someone is not talking in the background, that sort of thing. The tension back then. It wasn't like they all hated each other, that sort of thing. It was mostly like the arms races that was going on between the naval arms races between the German Empire and the British Empire and around the world. But other than that, it wasn't high tension back then. It was pretty cooperated. A lot of between highly cooperation between a lot of nations before the assassination. So.
1972, the Newfoundland was a cargo ship with a pretty average capacity, and at no point did
they're gonna go to the in that boat. It's a goddamn sailing boat. Like an armored. What do you call it again? Armored, an iron, not like an ironclad. A proper merchant ship, but it looks like it was built in like 1870s. Not really a ship that I would take to go to the Arctic. Not even after the 1900s.
Did icebreaking come up in the design plans? This is because there was just no reason to put an icebreaking hull on a cargo ship, since they can simply move to a more southern shipping lane in the winter. Sealing ships, on the other hand, had no choice, since ice is where the seals are. After spending the first part of its career lugging cargo as it was designed, the Newfoundland was bought and repurposed as a sealing ship. Without an icebreaking hull, though, it was a sealing ship in name only. In addition to that, among the other ships in the area, the Newfoundland was one of the smaller ones at just 212. In addition to that,
I think this is the year it was built, and this is the location of where it was built and who the company who built it. I think it was 1872. I think that's the case here, if I remember my sailing days.
Among the other ships in the area, the Newfoundland was one of the smaller ones at just 212 feet long with a beam just 29 feet wide. It also had a 2-cylinder compound steam engine that maxed out at only 130 horsepower. This did next to nothing to assist in clearing any ice from the ship's path. Basically, compared to a purpose-built sealing ship, the Newfoundland's captain and crew were at a serious disadvantage. So on March 30th, 1914, the Newfoundland ground to a halt while trying to work its way through an ice floe. The ship's captain on this run was Westbury Keene, the 27-year-old son of Abram Keene. In any other world, someone his age in that position was unheard of, but because of his father, he was pretty much guaranteed a promising career in sealing. This was because Abram wasn't just a ship captain, he was sort of a legend in the industry. Later, when he started a family, he had his sons alongside him on the bridge as soon as they were old enough. It was only a matter of time before they became captains of their own ships. As Westbury looked out of his binoculars while his crew struggled in vain to free the ship, he spotted his father's ship, the SS Stefano, in the distance. Abram and Westbury worked for competing sealing companies, so despite their relationship, helping one another was strictly prohibited. But they did it anyway. Knowing they were under the microscope of the entire Newfoundland sealing industry, though, they were discreet in their communication, so they came up with a signal. If either of them had spotted a seal herd, that ship would raise its derrick, which is a wooden crane on the deck used for loading and unloading. If the derrick was raised on one ship, the other would head in that direction. And since a raised derrick wasn't anything out of the ordinary for a ship, it was perfectly inconspicuous. As Westbury focused in on the Stefano, he suddenly wished he and his father had developed a signal for needing help getting unstuck from the ice. Because while assisting a competitor in finding seal herds was a no-no, ships could give or receive help in an emergency from any ship. Unlike the Newfoundland, the Stefano was a powerful icebreaker, which would have been extremely helpful, especially considering the ship had no radio. In fact, wireless communication was installed in ships almost by default around this time, but sealing companies didn't invest in these very expensive systems. The company who owned the ship had one installed to see if it would boost revenue by helping ships coordinate, but after several months with no change, they had it removed and then sold. To make the situation even more frustrating, when Westbury could see the deck of the Stefano clearly, he spotted its derrick in the raised position. This meant that not only were they stuck,
but did that, let's say if a different seal company ship gets stuck and they need help, is it forbidden by the other company ships to not intervene or help? This is a really weird rule. I mean, this is just 2 years, around 2 years since the sinking of the Titanic, and the rules of the maritime rules just starting to become really strict when it came to like when it comes to distress at sea. So that's a really weird rule.
They might miss out on whatever herd that his father had spotted. This left him with a difficult decision to make. He had to decide if he should try to send his crew to the Stefano on foot or just chalk this up as a missed opportunity. If there were only a few miles between the ships, there'd be nothing to consider, but Westbury estimated the distance to the Stefano to be between 5 and 7 miles. It wasn't unheard of to send crew that far, but that kind of distance created a lot of inefficient work, and that was a lot of time dedicated to a single hunt. In fact, if the signal had come from anyone but his father, he would have just kept his men aboard, but he knew that his father knew how to find large seal herds, which would make the extra distance worth it. While discussing this with Thomas Dawson, who was one of his masters of watch, Westbury made his decision and told Thomas that he was going to send the men to the Stefano on foot first thing in the morning. Since it would likely be a long day with a lot of work to do, Westbury told Thomas the crew could just stay the night on the Stefano instead of walking back the same day. Thomas then spread the word among the other men, and at 7 o'clock the next morning, 166 of the Newfoundland's crew gathered on the ice around their ship. The last man off was Westbury's second-hand, George Tuft, who had been in command of the crew on the hunt. He was given orders to report to the Stefano and then get the location.
Why so many? What did he say? 170? Why send so many?
Of the seal herd, and with that, the men set off across the ice. As Westbury watched the crew leave, he felt even more confident that this was the right decision. That morning was overcast with very little wind, visibility was also great, and the temperature was mild. Unfortunately, even despite these good conditions, the crew ran into problems almost immediately after leaving. Because of the warm spring weather, the ice floes were littered with weak spots. Every step the men took needed to be a cautious one, and the longer this went on, the longer the trek took. And even though they were careful, inevitably some of the men crashed through the ice into the freezing Atlantic before the crewmates would rush over to pull them out. When they were pulled back up onto solid ice, the soaked men had no choice but to continue on with the rest of the crew.
Yeah, I have experienced that, not just, voluntarily jumping into the ice cold waters and that sort of thing, either because of training or because of, just because, Scandinavians, as I said, we do we do have that tradition of jumping into icy waters and just cool off and that sort of thing. But I can tell you right now, it's a massive difference between North Atlantic Ocean and the Baltic when it comes to the winters, even though yes, they're both super cold, but my god, I have once bathed in North Atlantic, not Arctic region. It happened when I was north of Norway a long time ago. You can definitely feel the difference. Absolutely, it felt like knives sticking right into your hand. Yeah, I remember that. No. Ugh. I took one dip with my toe and it felt like I was putting my toe into lava. It was so cold. The only way to describe the feelings, and it was somewhere around December, somewhere around there, way off to Norway, atop in the Art Tundra region. It felt like I was stung, like sharp knives, small sharp knives, just sticking right into the toe. Ugh.
To make matters worse, if the Stefano was somewhere between the
And to be accidentally fall into that sort of water, and then just keep on going. Oh my god. Your clothes will be very uncomfortable to wear. It will be start to become more heavier, and then it will start to turn to more ice, and it's going to be more uncomfortable to move, and it's going to be more heavier. And then of course you have the coldness. You're not going to feel warm, and poor bastard.
5 to 7 miles, like Westbury believed, the walk should have taken around 2.5 hours to complete. But it wasn't until 10 o'clock, 3 hours after the left, when they reached just the halfway point. Thankfully, from there on, the ice was smooth and solid, so they could at least pick up the pace, but getting to that point had been exhausting. Around this time as well, a light snow began to fall, and while this was far from out of the ordinary, some of the men expressed concerns that things might get worse when they noticed how much the temperature had dropped since they'd left. Then, when some of the crewmen toward the back of the group had killed and collected 6 stray seals along the walk, they decided to take them back to the Newfoundland right away, rather than drag them the rest of the way to the Stefano. Others within earshot used this as an opportunity to abandon the mission too. Throughout the walk as well, the Stefano remained in sight, but as the crew closed in on it, the ship seemed to just move farther away. This prompted another handful of crewmen to also use this as justification to head back. Then another group used the increasingly bad weather as a reason to turn around too, so in total, 34 of the crew would turn back before ever reaching the Stefano. The rest of the crew continued on, but because they were so spread out, many of the men near the front didn't even know so many had turned back. Either way, thanks to the improved ice conditions on the second half of the trek and the Stefano eventually seeing them and closing the distance, the first of the Newfoundland crew arrived at the ship around 11:30 a.m., about 4.5 hours after they set off. As the crew came on board, Abram was there to personally welcome them and invite them inside for tea and bread, but because he was distracted, he didn't realize how exhausted they were. His focus was on his own ship's operations, and his much larger crew was split up on the ice floes all around the area. So while his demeanor was kind and warm, he couldn't hide how anxious he was to get back to his own work. Once all 132 remaining crewmen from the Newfoundland were aboard, Abram ordered the ship to the seal herd's last known location. About 20 minutes later, the Stefano came to a stop, and then Abram reappeared in front of the crew and ordered them to finish up their food and then return to the ice for the hunt. Now, here is where the first of a series of mistakes was made that would have catastrophic consequences.
So he just ordered them off the ship after a long journey. Hell, I would be like, man, take a day or two off, just relax. You're going to need it. I will send some of my men over to your ship and make sure that they are, okay. And just few, not like a bunch of them, because it's going to sink down everybody.
The night before, Abram's first officer also estimated the distance between the two ships to be between 5 and 7 miles. And he told the captain that the walk should take the Newfoundland crew no more than 2.5 hours to reach them if Westbury ended up sending them. Unfortunately, no one with the Newfoundland crew told Abram or anyone else what time they'd actually left that morning. Based on when they got there, it was assumed that they left around 9 o'clock. Abram had no idea that they actually started walking 2 hours earlier than that when he ordered them off the ship after less than a half an hour break. However, the crew didn't argue, nor would they, considering who the order was coming from, so they finished their tea and started to filter back outside. When they reached the deck, though, they couldn't believe their eyes. When they boarded, the crew could easily spot the Newfoundland in the distance. By then, it looked like someone had wrapped a big white curtain around the entire ship. As this was happening, George met with Abram on deck to get his orders and also saw how much the storm had progressed, and for a fleeting moment even wondered if he should refuse the orders. He then turned to Abram and asked him what he thought.
This is a death sentence. Are you kidding me? Half an hour rest? What a dumb. I mean, he's the captain. He's experienced this. What he should know that, yeah, the harsh condition this is. Like, what the? Okay. I'm just baffled. Half an hour. What? 4 hour of just marching across the desolate ice and cold and just for half an hour rest.
The weather might do. In response, Abram told him that things would pass and there was nothing to worry about. And because of Abram's reputation and experience, George immediately trusted what he said to be true. During their discussion as well, Abram told George which direction to go and told him to collect 1,500 seal pelts before calling it a day. He also told him that the area they'd be going was about 2 miles closer to the Newfoundland than where they were. Because of this, he also told George to just head back to the Newfoundland when their work was done instead of staying the night on the Stefano. After their conversation, George left the Stefano with the others and began to walk in the direction of the herd. After about 15 minutes of walking, Thomas met up with George to ask what Abram had told him, and George went on to explain how many pelts they were supposed to collect and then where to go after. Immediately, Thomas was taken aback by the instructions to return to the Newfoundland. Westbury had told Thomas the opposite. Unfortunately, before he could argue, they came upon the seal herd, so the men ended their conversation and got to work. Incredibly, only a few minutes into the job, conditions had gotten so bad so quickly that George gathered the officers to discuss what to do. And unanimously, due to the cold and whiteout conditions, they decided to abandon the mission and return to the Newfoundland immediately. Even though it was just after noon, some of the crewmen were already in bad shape because of how unprepared they were for the weather they were caught in. Sealing being the physical work it is, seal hunters were notorious for underdressing and traveling light. With how comfortable morning temperatures had been, many of the men didn't even wear coats or hats, and those who fell through the ice on the walk to the Stefano were already visibly shivering. This meant that everyone was either exhausted, cold, soaking wet, or some combination of the three. Seal hunters also rarely brought food with them, so in addition to everything else, the men were hungry. Unfortunately, there wasn't a whole lot George could do about it other than try to get them back to the Newfoundland as quickly as possible. Before they set off, George met with Thomas again and asked him to lead the group in a southeasterly direction. Visibility was near zero, so rather than navigate back to the ship by sight, Thomas would have to rely on his compass. Based on where Abram had told him they were, heading southeast would bring them to the path they took to reach the Stefano that morning. Once they got there, George estimated they'd be about 1.5 miles away from the Newfoundland, and all they'd need to do was follow the path until they reached it. George then walked to the back of the group to help anyone who was walking slower and ensure no one was left behind. But what George didn't know was that they were not where he thought they were. Abram had made a mistake calculating their position. After almost 3 hours of walking to the southeast, finally the men got to the trail they were on that morning. They knew that's where they were because there was a flag belonging to the Stefano that was fixed into the ice to mark several seal pelts. When George got to the intersection though, something wasn't right to him. He realized the flag they stumbled on was the path, but this was 1.5 miles from the Stefano, not the Newfoundland. That meant they were at least 3.5 miles away from the Newfoundland still. But although this was frustrating, they had no other option, so George told Thomas to just keep going. By this point, everyone was beginning to walk a little slower, but then all of a sudden, they heard the sound of a blaring ship whistle, which they recognized as the Newfoundland. When the whistle went silent, the men screamed as loudly as they could, hoping that their ship would hear them and continue blowing the whistles so they could use the sound to guide them back. This was standard practice in low visibility, but after the whistle blew again 5 minutes later, that was the last time they heard it. This is likely because everyone in the Newfoundland was under the impression that the crew was safe on the Stefano, as they had agreed. In fact, it's unclear why it was even sounded in the first place. However, at the very least, hearing it those couple of times confirmed they were heading in the right direction. As if things couldn't get any worse, as the walk continued and the sun was setting, Thomas lost the path. So, completely off course in the dark, with the snow falling heavily, George had to consider whether it was better to stop for the night or keep going. Horrifyingly, no matter what he decided, men would die. Continuing on meant that they'd have to walk for miles, in the dark, on the ice, where men would fall through into the water. On the other hand, staying the night on the ice meant that some of the men wouldn't wake up in the morning. This meant he had to decide between some of his men drowning or some of his men simply not waking up in the morning. He eventually decided to stop for the night rather than...
Okay, so we're going to stop. So that's difficult. The good thing about continuing even is that you keep your body active and warm during this extreme harsh condition. Staying, you're just going to sit down and let the coldness take over your body. you're not going to be so active, and your blood is not going to pump around your body, and he warm you up. So that's a very, very dangerous situation. But also if they are building shelters and something, it could be passable. But also continue during the night. It's also a really big hazard. It's hard. That's a very hard decision. Even after like several hours just walking, you can still just walk slowly, but also you need sleep. Oh, this is a hard decision. I would choose to stay, but I will make sure that I will build a very good shelter.
Whisk the ice. The crew then split into 3 groups and made preparations for the night. Shelters were then built from loose pieces of ice, and fires were lit using ropes and flags. Before long, the ice was quiet and the crewmen were fast asleep. A little while later, the winds changed direction and the snow turned to freezing rain. Since some of the men built up only one side of their shelter to block the wind, and none of them were able to build a roof with what little they had, the men were pelted with freezing rain afterward. At first light on April 1st, the crewmen who made it through the night began to wake up. Those who were awake huddled together for warmth while they kept their eyes on the ice shelters scattered around them. Each time someone got up and joined them, there was a slight sense of relief, but as the minutes went by, the men stopped waking up. The others went around and checked each of the shelters, but none of the men still inside were just sleeping. George didn't even need a head count to know that things were far worse than he imagined. Overnight, almost half the crew had frozen to death. And unfortunately, there was no time to let it sink in. George then had the men gather the
Probably hypothermia. I always wondered, because you know that condition, what is it called again? When you're so cold, it feels like you're heating up. I don't remember that condition, what it's called, but a lot of people are, when they hear about it, say it must be the best way to, if you're gonna die in a very in an accident or something, hypothermia, whatever it's called, hypothermia undressing, something like that. It's probably one of the better ways to go, because at least you maybe feeling a little bit warm, maybe a little bit more calm, compared to maybe drowning. Drowning is one of my biggest fear. Like, I hate that feeling of being underwater and the possibility of not be able to breathing. That would just, I would be panicking. And also claustrophobia and that sort of thing. But either just being shot in by a bullet, make it quick, or hypothermia, when you feel at least that you're starting to become more warmer, and then maybe you're passing out and then eventually unfortunately die. But I would rather choose one of those instead of the other. Then of course you have the heat stroke and that sort of thing, when you're in a warm climate. I think it's much more of a hazard and long and outdrawn death when there's like in a hot area compared to cold. So, but still, there's a lot of people, a lot of relatives that going to mourn. Like, remember, maybe each person probably have maybe a wife, 1 or 2 kids, 1 or 2 parents, and step parents, like, and cousins. Like, there's a lot of relatives that,
bodies for the Newfoundland to pick up later. When the dead were stacked together, the remaining crew turned and continued their walk. The freezing rain overnight turned back into snow in the morning, so George and Thomas had to go right back to relying on a compass. However, thankfully, for the first time since they left the ship the previous morning, the crew finally had some good luck. During the early afternoon, the snow slowed and then stopped altogether. Because of this, George expected to see the ship when visibility improved, but the only ship any of them could see was the SS Bellaventure. This was another sealing ship that was back to work now after weather cleared. And this ship was about 2 miles to the northwest, so back in the direction they had just come. George was sure that the Newfoundland was further to the southeast, but because it was far enough it was out of sight, he had no choice but to try to make it to the Bellaventure instead. When they were within a mile of this new ship, excitement began to grow among the crew. The night spent on the ice was sort of the opposite of restful, and the men didn't have much left physically or mentally. This temporary boost of energy was just enough to get them the rest of the way to the ship, and then, when the Bellaventure started steaming toward the crowd of men on the ice, the relief was overwhelming. They were saved. With a quarter mile between the men and the ship, they could see the crew of the Bellaventure busy at work loading seals onto the deck. Then, a moment later, the ship's crew was back on board, and then, unbelievably, the Bellaventure began to move away from them. The men waved their hands and shouted to get the attention of the crew they could clearly see on the deck, but between their focus on their work and the sound of the ship's engine, the crew on the ship never saw the crew on the ice. Had the Newfoundland crew been spotted, they would have been aboard the Bellaventure within just 15 minutes. As you might imagine, this was devastating. And it seemed
I can't imagine that. My God, that must be a moral hit. That must be such a damage to the morale. Oh,
the last straw for many of the crewmen in the worst shape. While they turned back to the southeast, the delirium of hypothermia became apparent. There is a condition known as paradoxical undressing that occurs with advanced hypothermia.
Just as I said it as well, paradoxical undressing. That's the word.
This is when physiological changes cause the person to feel extremely hot instead of extremely cold, and causes them to remove their clothing to cool down, or if there's a body of water nearby, to jump in it to cool down. So as they continued, every so often, the men would whip around when they heard the splash of a crewmate either jumping into the water intentionally or falling through accidentally. When it seemed all hope was lost, miraculously, another ship came into view and it was heading directly toward them. As it got closer, they recognized it as the Stefano. Abram or one of his men must have spotted them. After the deflating ship setting a few hours earlier, the crewmen had another surge of energy, seeing the Stefano heading in their direction. This time, they didn't even wait until the ship was close enough to start waving and screaming, but then, when the ship was less than a mile away, it turned. The panicked crew tried to wave harder and scream louder, but they realized the Stefano hadn't seen them after all. By then, the sun was setting and it was becoming clear they'd have to spend another night on the ice, during which more of the men would freeze and wouldn't wake up the following day. Between all the sightings and their worsening condition, the situation was as chaotic as it was hopeless. This was then only compounded by the fact that moments later, another ship was spotted, and because of everything going on, the men weren't even sure if they were hallucinating. But sure enough, the ship really was there, and this time it was the Newfoundland. Unfortunately, George estimated that it was about 4 to 6 miles away. There was just no way the men could walk that far after all they'd been through. Not to mention they'd once again have to cross.
Are you kidding me? I don't care if I got spaghetti legs by that time. Easy to me to say it right now, but I would, by all the powers in the universe, I will goddamn crawl my way if I have to. These poor bastards.
Across a very dangerous stretch of ice. George thought about it and then walked over to meet with Thomas about what to do next, but it was immediately apparent that Thomas was in bad shape. During their conversation, he realized that this might be as far as many of the men could go, yet at the same time, it was more urgent than ever that he could get on any ship he could. It was then that he made a decision. Thomas and the men who could go no further would stay where they were for the night, while he led another group that was more fit to continue on. At most, he figured it would take the smaller group no more than 4 hours to reach the Newfoundland. Once they got there, they'd immediately return to rescue the others. George then announced the plan to the remaining men and asked those who were willing and able to join him. He expected about half of them to stay and half of them to continue walking, but only 9 other men stepped forward. This was bad. If more than 50 men were in such bad shape that another night on the ice felt like a better option than being on the Newfoundland in a few hours, things were worse than he thought. Either way, once the men were ready, they set off once again across the ice. The first part of the walk went faster than George expected, but he knew the pace would slow down once the ice changed again. At the midway point, they took their first steps onto the more treacherous section of ice. Every so often, George would look up to use the Newfoundland's position as a visual guide. Then, after a few rounds of this, George lifted his eyes, and to his horror, the Newfoundland was no longer directly in front of him. Throughout that same afternoon, Westbury kept watching the bridge and was uncharacteristically anxious about the status of his crew. The men hadn't returned in the hours after the storm dissipated, and then when night fell, his concern shifted to pure dread. He was completely helpless to do anything about it. His ship was still stuck, and there was no way of contacting any other ship. As he waited, hoping to see anyone coming across the ice, the only thing he could do was constantly push his ship to break free. Him and his crew tried in vain for hours to get the Newfoundland free until finally they heard a sharp cracking sound sometime in the middle of the night. Suddenly, the engine wasn't just spinning in place, the ship was finally moving for the first time in 3 days. When it was finally out, they steamed off toward the last known location of the crew. Unfortunately, the small group of men led by George was just 30 minutes from boarding the ship when they watched it steam away into the distance. Back on the ice with the group waiting, the men didn't even have to wait until
My God. It just gets worse and worse and worse. Okay, at this point I would say that my morale would be all-time low. It couldn't go any farther down if I saw a ship just sailing away.
morning to start counting bodies. Before many of them had even laid down for the night, several more had died. The men who were in better shape carried the bodies as they found them and stacked them in one spot like they had done that morning. Horrifyingly, because they were certain he wouldn't make it through the night, the crew stacked the bodies around Thomas, who was one of the few unconscious men still alive at the time. Then, as if 3 devastating moments believing they were saved wasn't enough, the Belle Venture once again came into view. Regardless, they tried getting the attention of the ship's crew, either those aboard the ship or the ones waiting on the ice to be picked up after their hunt. As they screamed, the air around them began to cloud up. The Belle Venture was actually so close to them, the smoke billowing out of its stacks was being blown by the wind directly at the Newfoundland crew, and this obscured them from sight. So once again, when the crew were aboard, the Belle Venture turned and steamed away. At first light the following morning, with his group of 9, George immediately got up and looked around for any ship in sight and saw 2. One was the Belle Venture, which had only moved to spend the night in a better position for the next day's work. The other was the Newfoundland, which was again somewhere between 4 and 6 miles away. He was also relieved to see that all 9 men with him made it through the night, but by then, 7 men didn't feel like they could go any further. George then noted their location and then set off with the other 2 toward the Newfoundland. A little while later, the 7 men who stayed behind noticed that the Belle Venture was much closer than where it was when they woke up, and it wasn't nearly as far as the Newfoundland. Because of this, 2 of them felt like they had just enough energy to reach it, so they headed off in that direction. So as a quick recap, because I know there are a lot of moving pieces, by this point there were 5 groups. The first are the ones that passed away on the first night that were left on the ice. The second are those that stayed behind with Thomas after they couldn't go any further. Then there is George's group of 9, which splintered into a further 3 groups. From these 3, the first are once again the ones that couldn't go any further. Then there is George and 2 others heading toward the Newfoundland, and the final group is a group of 2 heading toward the Belle Venture because it got closer to them. In any case, later that morning, Abram stood on the bridge of his ship scanning the ice around him for seals or a group of his men to pick up. As he was doing this, the door to the wheelhouse flew open and the wireless operator rushed in and handed him a slip of paper. The captain looked down at it and almost immediately yelled an order to the wheelmen to change course. The wheelman then spun the wheel as far as it would go and had the engine go full steam ahead. The slip of paper still in Abram's hand was a message from the Belle Venture requesting any ships in the area that could come help assist in the rescue of the stranded members of the Newfoundland's crew. Those final 2 men had actually managed to get to the Belle Venture.
Dude, I wonder what their reaction must have been on. They must have been like, the moment they got the list of meat from the ship, and they must have felt like euphoria in sort of way. Like, just, I can imagine them just kneeling down, screaming up at the top of the lung towards the heaven, with their arms out. That's something I would do at least.
At the same time, aboard the Newfoundland, Westbury was almost a mirror image of his father, standing on the bridge while looking back and forth across the ice. Then he spotted 3 black dots in the distance. He raised his binoculars and immediately recognized George. Unfortunately, he couldn't risk moving toward them or the ship might get stuck, so he could only pace the deck as he waited for the 3 men. When they were finally aboard, George told Westbury exactly where 2 groups of men were left alive. There wasn't much the Newfoundland could do because of its poor ability to navigate the ice, but thankfully, it wouldn't need to. The entire Belle Venture crew was already on the ice, armed with stretchers, food, and coffee. The Newfoundland crewmen who could do so walked aboard the Belle Venture under their own power, but many of them couldn't move due to severe frostbite on their legs. Soon after, the Stefano and another sealing ship, the SS Florizel, arrived to help load up the rest of the survivors. The ordeal was finally over after 54 hours. Then, once everyone alive was on board, the crews got to work loading the ships with the ones who passed away. Morbidly, because the ships were full, the bodies had to be stacked on the deck like seals waiting to be stowed in the hull. As this was happening, back in St. John's, panic had broken out. The Belleventure sent word of the tragedy intended for the hospital so they could prepare, but news leaked and spread throughout the city. On April 3rd, the entire city had to effectively shut down because thousands of people flooded telegraph offices and crowds blocked the streets waiting for any updates from the Belleventure. The following day, those same thousands that crowded the streets the day before were at the harbor waiting for the first sight of the ships. When they were close enough, the entire crowd broke out in hysterics. Still on the bow was a tall and obvious stack of corpses. Tragically, this is how some of the family members of the deceased men learned the fate of their loved ones. When the ship was docked, it took several hours for each of the survivors to carefully be taken off the ship and transported to the hospital. In all, only 55 of the 132 men that made it to the Stefano on March 31st lived to make it back. Wow. And one of them would pass away in the hospital days later, putting the death toll at 78. As if by fate at the
And also all the people who must amputate their fingers, their toes, their feet, their hands, maybe part of their maybe nose, ears, or their legs, arms, some part of their torso, all because of frostbite. So there would probably be a lot of injuries as well.
Exact same time the crew of the Newfoundland was fighting for their lives, another ship, the SS Southern Cross, amplified the tragedy. It was loaded with more than 35,000 seal pellets, which is believed to have been more than it could handle, and it sank, taking all 174 men to the bottom of the ocean. All told, St. John's lost 251 men in the first days of April 1914.
Wow.
When the rest arrived at the hospital, the battle for some of them was far from over. Every single one of the 55 men who returned on the Belleventure suffered from extensive injuries that were either life-threatening or life-altering. Nearly all of them needed to have a limb or appendage amputated due to frostbite, like Thomas, who would lose both of his legs. George was one of the very few who came back in relatively good physical condition, but he had another battle that was just getting started. When the dust settled, Newfoundland formed a committee to investigate the disaster. Since no one survived on the southern...
I would blame the captain of the Stefano, I think it was, because he should have been more what we call now. He should have asked more questions. Why do you leave their ship, and when exactly, and how long have to travel, and at least give them a day or two off to relax, and send maybe a small party over to the other ship and try to gather the situation, like reports about the crew and the ship and the surrounding areas, if it's deemed to be in danger or that sort of thing. Then they can try to take all the crew on board their ship. I would blame all of this on the captain, on the Stefano, because he ordered those men to go to abandon, go off the ship and that sort of thing.
Cross, many of the details of its sinking are still a mystery to this day, and it also caused the Newfoundland to be the sole focus of the inquiry. After several months of interviews, the commission's report was released, and it was damning for George, Westbury, and Abram. They did manage to avoid criminal charges because there was no singular cause named by the report, but there was still a lot of blame to go around. The report went on to detail inconsistencies in each of their accounts of those 4 days in the North Atlantic. Westbury claimed he instructed George to take shelter with the Stefano for the night, but George testified that he didn't recall being told that. He said his orders were to take the men to the Stefano and receive orders from Abram. George was also criticized for not refusing Abram's orders once he saw how bad the weather was, and the commission found him guilty of poor judgment. Westbury was guilty of the same moral charge, but came out of the report a little more favorably. Because he had so little information at his disposal, the report noted the company that owned the ship set the captain up to fail. This left the brunt of the blame to be placed on Abram. He was found guilty of the same poor judgment, but the evidence to support the commission's decision was much more extensive than it had against George and Westbury. In the end, the committee faulted Abram for 3 things. The first was sending the Newfoundland's men back onto the ice after only 20 minutes of rest. Second was sending them onto the ice at all given the conditions, and then finally for giving George the order to return to the Newfoundland after their work was done. But nothing damaged Abrams' reputation more than his botched calculations for where the Stefano was going to drop the men off. Any experienced captain should know how to chart an accurate course, and this error set the disaster in motion since George made all his calculations based off the incorrect ones he received from Abram. Despite this, Abram would...
It doesn't matter if you get it once or 2 or 3 times. You are going to need at least more than that. I want you all to tell me exactly everything. Like, and you have to do it correctly. that is me. I want the location, time, everything. You're gonna tell me that how many times? At least 20 times. Not once, not 2, not 3, but 20 times you have to tell me exactly.
Spend another 20 years in sealing, and he regained much of the respect he lost as a result of the disaster. He would go on to retire, having captured more than 1 million seal pellets. In the aftermath, the combined disasters of the Newfoundland and the Southern Cross sparked sweeping changes to the sealing industry in the British colonies and elsewhere, among many other regulations intended to improve crew safety.
Good.
If you made it this far,
That was a nice video. Not very tragic event, absolutely. All of that could have been avoided, especially mainly for the first ship. It could easily been avoided if the captain just said, okay, let's just wait a couple of days or see how the weather turns out, or we can take our ship to yours much closer, something. Anyway, thank you all for watching. Go and sub to Scary Interesting. He does some really good videos, absolutely. This was my first for a long time, actually. I think the last one I saw must have been the one with was it with the guy who got stuck in the cave? I think that was the last one I saw from the channel. Anyway, thank you all for watching. See you all later, whatever it's going to be. Probably the anime figurine review on the Minisa, I can't pronounce her name. You're just gonna have to wait and see. Anyway, thank you all for watching.